So over to you, Ben.
Thank you, Jonathan. It's certainly a pleasure to be here and meet some of you and see the facilities, and it's all very new to me. But very impressed, obviously, and aware of some of you and some of your work that you're doing, and yeah, it's just great to be here and have the chance to cover a topic, I guess, that has been a long time coming. Sort of been thinking about this area for 15 odd years now, and well, I don't want to preempt too much, but still scratching my head a lot around this whole concurrent training area. And just to try and provide a little bit of context before we start looking at particular studies and things of that nature, I just want to talk about the foundations and the specificity of training adaptation. You know, if we look at those that purely undertake a single mode of training, that mode of training being resistance training, we know what sort of adaptive phenotype we're going to end up with if we continue to undertake that over months and years. And similarly, if we're looking at the opposite end of what we might call an adaptation continuum, we might have our endurance-only training athletes, where again, you're providing a similar stimulus, you're changing certain aspects of program variables, but the mode of training itself, at least 80 to 90% training for those sports, is single mode training, and it's pushing the adaptation profile a different way. Now what's interesting is if we define those as ends of an adaptation continuum, and I appreciate that's quite a simplistic view of training for sport, but if we think about that way, the long-term adaptations that you end up with are very, very different. And I guess the point of interest to me is that many sports, in fact most sports, in fact some would argue the really interesting sports are those that fall somewhere in between there. Okay, there's so many sports that require some combination of strength, and power and endurance. And I think from a exercise prescription and programming standpoint, that those are the really interesting sports in terms of how do you achieve that balance. And where the sports fit is going to depend on the nature and the performance demands of those sports. From a physiologist physiology point of view, muscle contraction is where we're going to focus today. It's all about the muscle, at least has been for me over many years now. And if we think in terms of the process that occurs after every acute bout of exercise that we have, there's a stimulus or an overload, and then there's a response. And that response happens at a molecular level, generates the adaptation through a very complicated cascade of events that we still don't really necessarily understand that well. But we know that over time, repeated bouts of exercise, this process continues. The interesting question, again, for me, is that when we start putting very different stimuli into that muscle scenario, that muscle environment, is the muscle capable of coping with very different stimuli and driving adaptation response? Can you drive adaptation to the opposite ends of that continuum at the same time? Hence this area of concurrent training, where you need both aspects for performance, you need to train both aspects of the physiology of the individual. Is it actually possible to push someone's phenotype, their tissue characteristics, both ways without any issues or complications? So it's an interesting question to me as a physiologist. This is just a graph of a survey from Rugby Union, quite recent, just last year. I just put this in here because it seems that it's quite an important issue on this 1 to 5 scale, considering the concurrent training effect with people at the coalface. Now, I'll be the first to put my hand up and say I'm not working at the coalface, I'm an academic. But I know that many of you are, and so I'm really keen and interested to hear your thoughts and maybe generate some discussion about, you know, what are the issues, if there are issues, how important are they, a lot of factors that could determine how we approach concurrent training and how we set up training programs to achieve the best outcome in those sports. So today I want to spend a very short amount of time on a very complex topic. So I hope you can appreciate I may have to move quite quickly or skip over maybe what might be important aspects or studies. Have to drill down quite quickly, but look at, you know, is there an adaptation interference? Because driving adaptation to opposite ends of an adaptation continuum is actually incompatible, at least at some level. What does the research tell us that's out there? And obviously I've had to just select a very few number of studies maybe to provide some examples. And then what's more important maybe for me today is where to from here. Look at something of the body of knowledge, what's left to be answered, and hopefully we'll find that out. So what is this evidence, the evidence base out there that there is actually an interference effect when you combine endurance training and resistance, strength training in the same program in a concurrent way. I just want to quickly highlight here that it's not all one-way traffic. When we think about the influence of resistance training on endurance performance or on endurance adaptation, this is a nice synopsis of that area from Inyagam Mohica, who some of you may well know, a review with Ben Ronestad. And if we just focus on this left-hand side of the summary table, basically we see in terms of positive physiological effects or performance effects that there's many benefits to adding resistance training to endurance athletes programs. Conversely, in terms of negative outcomes of doing that, there don't really appear to be many, if any, negative outcomes, whether it's to do with, you know, compromised relative VO2, whatever it might be. There doesn't appear to be any negative outcomes in that way. So resistance training in many circumstances seems like it can be at least have no effect, but often has a very beneficial effect for endurance athletes. So just because of that fact, I don't find it as interesting. So that's all I'm going to talk about in terms of endurance athletes and endurance athletes incorporating resistance training into their programs. What I am going to spend a lot more time on is what is the influence of endurance type training on the adaptations associated with resistance training, that is hypertrophy, strength and power. So this is data from a very nice review of Jacob Wilson's when he was at the University of Tampa. It's a few years old now, but still I think shows the most convincing evidence. This was a meta-analysis of most, if not all, the available studies at that time in terms of whether there is or isn't adaptation interference with endurance and resistance training combined. So if we start off looking at lower body hypertrophy, as you see it left to right, we have cycling incorporated in the concurrent training program. In the middle is running. I apologise, it's the other way around. Running and then cycling, and this is our strength or resistance training only data, so for comparison. So as you can see, again, with strength training only, we have the largest effect size when it comes to promoting hypertrophy. Cycling is not too far off in terms of how much interference it's generating when it's combined, cycling combined with resistance training, and it seemed to be a more negative effect or a more attenuation of hypertrophy with a running endurance stimulus combined with resistance training. And we see relatively similar effects when it comes to strength, in terms of here's our resistance or strength training only versus cycling and running concurrent training. Lower body power, again, it's the same pattern. The magnitudes of effects aren't as great, but again, strength training on its own versus running and cycling, interference effects, attenuating, at least compared to strength training only. Hypertrophy, strength, power, and as we've already discussed, not too much difference in this case between running and cycling with the resistance training effects on VO2 max. In addition to that, we see in that meta-analysis this data here looking at the volume of exercise per day, ranging from 20 minutes up to 1 hour, and the effect sizes here on the y-axis. Again, we've got hypertrophy in red, strength in yellow, and the power in green. And you can see as volume of exercise, endurance-based exercise goes up, there's a concomitant decrease in terms of hypertrophy, strength, and power. They also report in that meta-analysis a pretty similar pattern when it comes to exercise frequency. So volume goes up or frequency goes up, and you tend to see more negative effects of endurance training on resistance training adaptation. So to me it's relatively clear that there is an interference effect. The problem is that with most of the data that's out there, we have no real mechanistic insight to explain these changes that are happening, to explain this attenuation in strength and hypertrophy that you get when you're combining endurance and strength training in the same program. Without that, we can't really know the how and the why this is happening. And if we did have that information, I think it would be a lot easier to start thinking about strategies to try and mitigate or reduce that interference effect. There's plenty of limitations. Before I go on to show you the studies themselves, put the limitations up front. Most of them are relatively short in terms of training studies, as is often the case. With us academics, tend to try and keep things as short as possible to manage the workload, but all of them pretty much under 20 weeks, but most of them are actually under 12 weeks. So certainly not representative for athletes with long training history or even developing athletes. There are studies that show quite the opposite, that there is no interference effect. Having looked at a lot of them quite closely, what you tend to find is that the participants or the subjects in those studies are generally either sedentary or quite untrained when they begin the program. And so what I believe you tend to see in those situations is that regardless of the exercise stimulus, you see a more generic effect in terms of the adaptation. So the endurance exercise, particularly when it's cycling, can actually generate some hypertrophy as well. And similarly with the resistance training and untrained people just beginning, adding resistance training, you can get some metabolic and potentially mitochondrial adaptation as well. So where no interference is seen, it's usually, at least in part, because they're untrained status, and usually they're only doing 2, maybe 3 sessions a week as, in those studies. And obviously I don't have to tell you guys that's not how athletes train. We've already covered resistance training generally has no meaningful negative effect if it's done the right way on endurance training adaptation. Can actually be beneficial. We haven't really talked about maintenance, if that's all you're really worried about, or maybe you have very mature athletes who have a long training history and maybe they don't need additional hypertrophy, maybe they don't need additional strength. When maintenance is required, obviously it's not as much of an issue. So that depends on the type of athlete, again, the history, maturation, those kind of issues. And as I've shown, you increase the component that is endurance training, whether it's in a frequency or a volume, a session volume dependent manner, then you tend to see this interference effect. So what could be the mechanism that's going on here? Well, it's hard to know, but obviously acute fatigue could be an issue. Maybe it's not really a molecular adaptation issue, it's more to do with just acute from the previous session, the fatigue. It means that you can't have the highest quality of training in a subsequent session that you might like. You've got residual fatigue from a previous session. Chronically, if we want to have athletes that are capable of adapting or pushing their adaptation to both ends of that adaptation continuum, compared to single mode trainers, then obviously they would have to be doing at least close to twice the amount of total work. And whether there's potential for overreaching or getting to overtraining status, not sure. We already talked about unfavourable or incompatible adaptation, and some of the molecular networks that are in there we are learning more about all the time, but it's not clear at the moment around some of those molecular events, and maybe again related to the increased training load. There could be potential that athletes might often be in negative energy balance, or at least energy restricted for certain sessions when they begin those sessions. So there's lots of potential mechanisms. I guess that's not as important as if there is an interference effect, what's the best way to try and mitigate that and come up with strategies to prevent it. Obviously we can be looking at things around exercise order. Should you do resistance training before endurance or vice versa? There's the time between sessions, what is optimal, when is an athlete recovered? The exercise itself, we've already talked about volume and frequency, maybe intensity issues here as well. Are there recovery strategies that can help in attenuating the interference, and also nutritional strategies as well? So I just want to delve a little bit deeper maybe into a couple of these issues or potential factors that we could look at manipulating, just to see what some of the research shows. So what can the science, whether it's basic or applied, tell us? So I've talked about incompatible adaptations, and so when we first started out thinking about this area, usually when it comes to research, if you want to have the best chance of finding an answer, you usually try and make it as extreme as possible in terms of your experimental design. So the way we went about it is trying to find individuals that were very well trained and only single mode trainers in endurance or resistance training. We figured we're going to try and get muscle samples from these individuals and see what the molecular profile in their muscle looks like when they undertake their habitual training session. What does it look like? But then these individuals who only train in one single mode, if we switch them over and provide this new stimulus, get them to do the opposite, if you like, what will their molecular profile look like? Will it be restricted or attenuated, suppressed, or not? So that's what we set out to do, and I'll try and cut to the chase here in terms of, at that time at least, we thought we knew what some of the important pathways were that are driving either mitochondrial biogenesis or protein synthesis. So obviously this is going to be more related to the resistance training adaptation profile that you get when you do a session. On the endurance side, might look a bit more like this in terms of what is upregulated. So what did we see? Well, if we start on the endurance side, what we actually saw was that, thinking about it in hindsight after we'd finished, it all made perfect sense, right? You've got cyclists who do a cycling session. Their response was to upregulate some of these pathway markers but because they do it all the time, it's much harder to get overload, right? It's harder to get a novel stimulus. And what we actually found is that the resistance training individuals, they had a much greater response because it was a new stimulus, a novel stimulus on the muscle. And it turns out that the opposite was true when they did the resistance training session. So again, the resistance trained individuals didn't have quite as large a response, and the cyclists did. So at least this was some initial evidence that there's nothing about the muscle phenotype that's incompatible that would restrict the normal response that you would see. In fact, it might have been much more novel when you saw a greater response than you might normally see. So it was quickly back to the drawing board, and what's another angle we could take? So obviously we've looked at opposite ends of the continuum, sort of trying to push apart, if you like, to the extremes. Well, what's the opposite extreme? You bring them, the two different exercise modes, as close together as possible to see what may be going on. And so that's what we did, and within this model we wanted to look at what's the effect of exercise order. So does the order that you do a concurrent training session, if you do them back to back, does it make any difference? Again, we're interested in the muscle, so we're taking muscle biopsies. This was a crossover design, so in the same individuals, getting them on 2 occasions, obviously resistance and then cycling, and then resistance on the other occasion. There's 15 minutes in between. We've got biopsies just here, and 15 minutes after the second session, and then another one 3 hours later. So I'm sure everybody's aware of IGF and what it is. So while it's not a perfect molecular marker, if you like, it may provide some idea about what the anabolic environment is after the exercise session. And so at that 3-hour point, after the resistance and the cycling, with resistance exercise first, we tend to see maybe a more anabolic environment or a stimulus compared to if cycling came before the resistance exercise. Now these other markers here involved with protein degradation. Don't need to go into detail, I don't think, for that there. And what we saw there was upregulated transcriptional activity with resistance exercise again, with the cycling second, and not vice versa. So because it's to do with muscle degradation, if we combine that with the sort of anabolic environment as well versus this is catabolic, both being upregulated, well, one way of interpreting that is that actually there's more muscle remodeling going on, so that's actually a good thing. But you could also interpret it as, well, these guys are up, so whatever anabolic results you get are going to be counteracted by catabolic. There's lots of discussion we could have just around that point itself, but we'll move on, because that didn't provide us with the clarity that we really hoped. But we also am acutely aware that this adaptation continuum model is completely oversimplistic. There are so many more stimulus that athletes put their body through, whether it's sprint, interval training, plyometrics, even flexibility work, putting stretch on the muscle, etc., etc. So we at least want to think about, well, if we're doing supramaximal exercise, does that change this order effect, or what sort of impact does it have? So here we simply took out the 30-minute ride at 70% of VO2 max, replaced it with 6-second maximal sprints. We did 10 of them, starting every minute, against the Wingate load, so the equivalent of doing 2 Wingates either before or after our resistance exercise, or the biopsies at the same point. Now, this is a different marker, one that is used often as a surrogate for protein synthesis. It's involved in translation initiation. And you can see here these open circles, that's the resistance exercise, and then the repeated sprints afterwards. So obviously this is on the uptick, when resistance exercise was the first session. As soon as we put the sprints afterwards, suppressed it straight away. Okay, so we know repeated sprints, one of the major outcomes obviously is acidosis, drop in pH in the muscle, having to deal with hydrogen ions and lactate. Whether that is what's causing that, we're not sure. We saw something of a similar response, but remember this is 3 hours post-exercise. We're back to IGF-1 here again, thinking about that anabolic environment. Completely suppressed in this scenario. So we also saw upregulation, again, of a marker of protein degradation in the muscle. So what this said to us was, despite the differences here, when it comes to 3 hours later, sprint exercise and that acidosis probably having quite a negative effect potentially on the anabolic environment in terms of trying to promote hypertrophy from resistance training. And probably a good idea to keep that as far away from your resistance training stimulus as possible. And that might be a bit of a stretch with small numbers and things, but we always like to see our research in its most positive light. Others might not see it that way. Very quickly, we're talking about this exercise intensity issue. This is new research that came out very recently from the guys at VU, Dave Bishop and his team. They did a training study comparing continuous endurance exercise versus high intensity interval training. So they had a HIIT group along with resistance training. This MICT is just continuous endurance training bout. And of course they had a resistance training only group. The endurance training always preceded the resistance exercise, so they obviously just decided to hitch their wagon to that particular exercise order. So we don't know what would have happened if the order was different, and they used the percent of lactate threshold as their stimulus, but not a high, particularly high stimulus, and not a lot of volume to it at 15 to 30 minutes and 5 to 10 reps in 2 minutes at that intensity. But what did they see? Well, this is lower body lean mass. This is the percent change, and there was an increase in lean mass across the board, but the resistance training only group was the only one to increase muscle mass or lean mass in the lower body. In terms of strength, this is 1 RM leg press, again percent change. You can see that they all managed to have an increase, but here we start to see the interference effect again of the endurance training stimulus, and no effect of the different exercise intensities, both equally attenuated compared to resistance training only. And finally, when we think about power, counter movement jump, force here, rate of force development type stimuli or test, I should say. And again, we see that interference effect of training with the endurance combined with the resistance training compared to resistance training only in terms of the percent change. That's quite significant. So confirming the study, confirming interference effect with endurance combined with resistance training. Again, this is in the same session. No real effect of intensity in this particular study. So the first of its kind is to sort of look at this intensity issue. Again, I'll just try and wrap this up quite quickly. Whether acute fatigue is an issue, well, this particular study from a couple of years ago now, don't ask me why, but they chose to use an elliptical machine. It's not really apparent why they did that. But 30 minutes of endurance exercise, you got back squat or bench press, 3 sets to failure, compared with obviously no elliptical machine beforehand, before undertaking the resistance exercise. And just in an acute bout setting, back to back, not surprisingly, we see the number of reps completed per set without the endurance exercise stimulus. here compared to with it. You can see again in this acute, more performance related or training quality approach in this study, we see that the quality of work or the amount of work that can be done in the session is reduced when you're endurance training as before your resistance training. Now, how that stacks up long term, again, we don't know. And just thinking about this chronic fatigue issue, again, this is a little bit older and it's kind of confusing in a lot of ways with the acronyms here, but this is in rowers, trained male rowers in Spain, in the Spanish National Leagues. It was an 8-week intervention, doing the resistance training aspect twice per week on top of the rowing program. They use 4 or 2 exercises. The important takeaway here is one group trained to failure, so this is 4 exercises training to failure versus 4 exercises not trained to failure. So they did half the number of reps, their maximum reps that they could do in their test. They then used half that number as the training stimulus. And the control here is not strength training only, but it's rowing only. We won't worry too much about this 2R NRF because that's just 2 of the 4 exercises. But kind of interesting, lots of limitations to this study as with all research, but interesting that the group that did not train to failure at each session across that 8 weeks had a slightly greater increase in strength, but also when it comes to, you see their power profile here on the bench pull, this is the repetition failure group again compared to the non-repetition failure. So whether the accumulation of fatigue, of training to failure all the time in the gym setting on top of the rowing lead to this attenuation compared to the non-repetition failure group being more beneficial. Now, I'm not 100% sure, but it's kind of interesting again. These are things that probably need to be followed up in lots of ways. So just wrapping it up, what can this research tell us in terms of concurrent training? The breadth of research, which I haven't presented here today, honestly, not much. Just a bit of a sad state of affairs, but I guess in some ways it's good because there's lots of work to be done and maybe we can continue to be meaningfully employed to try and tackle some of these issues if we can convince the right people. But I guess the thing is, there's lots of evidence, but it's for and against the interference effect. It's for and against whether endurance should come first or resistance should come first. It's for and against whether you can get away with doing sessions on the same day or whether they should always be done on different days. And there is obviously work still going on. I'm still involved in some projects with my old lab. Obviously we're trying to think and plan about where do we go from here. It's completely an under-researched area despite it being 2017. You might have thought that we might have made a bit more progress in this area as with some others. But it really lacks clarity in part because of the difficulties in drawing any conclusions from the literature. So the important thing I guess is what's happening in the coalface, and I don't know the answers to that question. I do try and talk to as many people as I can, but then again you hear lots of different approaches in terms of how much time between sessions. There's the practicalities of, particularly in professional sports, and the player unions dictating how long players can be at the club each day, and coaches trying to squeeze everything in that they need to. There's not always the luxury of training every other day or keeping sessions 6 hours apart. There are lots of practical issues here. So, and again, just when we think about these guys and their rugby union survey, how do people try and avoid the interference effect, at least in those practitioners that are doing it day in, day out, while periodisation and the order of strength and endurance training, where one is most important, seems to be 1 and 2 here, the main focus at the moment. But what that's based on is not clear, and not something that the survey went into in particular. So I guess from our perspective as academic researchers anyway, but also applied researchers, we've got to consider what's the important question, what's the first thing you would want to know, should we go and look at that? Is there something that's more important than the others? What are the issues here? What questions do you want answered in terms of this whole concurrent training conundrum that we have? So with that, just to acknowledge a lot of the people that we're working with and that I have in the past, and I appreciate your time and listening this afternoon. Thanks very much.
I'm sure Vernon's happy to take any questions.
Or I'd be happy to hear how people approach the problem, if it is a problem for anybody.
Can I ask, is there any research around, let's say, separating it completely? Like, I'm from swimming, could imagine that you do 3 months strength, focus, and then shift into endurance, for example?
I'm not aware of anything as longitudinal as that in terms of looking at block training where you keep the two separate. So you talk about, I assume, talking about developing one or focusing on one for several months, and then switch the focus to try and maintain the adaptations that you've accrued over that time. Well, then you start adding the different stimulus. And no, I don't think anyone has attempted to try and monitor that.
Yeah. And would your research suggest that might be a good idea, or not at all?
I think it could be, that block approach. I guess I'm thinking about the first study I showed today, where you can build up adaptation in one aspect, and it doesn't reduce your ability to respond when you switch to the other one, the other aspect of training. So I think in that way that could potentially work. We don't know. I couldn't even speculate as to how maintaining whatever adaptations you've accrued over that time, whether that's possible, when you start adding a lot more training load in the other aspect. But I would say you've got a lot better chance at doing that than maybe combining them right from the start.
What about if you did just something like that, but you instead of having 3-month blocks, you use your lighter week when you're doing endurance training to really focus on strength training, so you didn't have sort of long blocks where you could get do training, but you think that would be worth trying? Yeah,
look, maybe 3-week blocks, maybe. I can recall a study, but I hesitate to use it in case it was done in rats. A guy called Riki Ogasawara in Japan, he did an interesting study where they used 3 weeks resistance training and then 3 weeks of detraining in a repeated way versus continual resistance training periodised across a whole 12-week period. And when you got to the end of the 12 weeks, they were both still at the same strength and hypertrophy levels. So maybe there is some scope to be looking at shorter training blocks over time, and sort of switching the emphasis every. I'm just using 3 weeks as an example, but a month, a macro cycle in terms of switching focus between exercise modes. Yeah, be a great approach to be able to take. Yeah.
Thanks for your presentation, Vernon. Claire Minahan from Griffith Uni.
Hi.
I'm wondering whether they even put a taper in most of these studies. So the thing that surprised me was the improved strength with the to exhaustion strength training versus going to exhaustion, and you saw athletes better able to maintain strength when endurance was placed first, when they didn't go to exhaustion. And it tells me that they're probably fatigued, and that potentially it's the testing protocol that might be the issue, and that they're not tapering their athletes. And if they did a proper taper, you would actually find that maybe strength was improved even when you had endurance training.
Oh, that's entirely possible and an excellent point. Yeah, I think you're right. Typically, again, I can't recall every study right now, but what you tend to see is, there might be a 48-hour or 72-hour period with no training, and then they would test. Not a true taper, as you're suggesting. So I think that's a real fair comment. Yeah.
Jonathan, with regard to the study by David Bishop, I wonder if you could speculate, comment on whether the differences were due to a difference in the total workload. So was the resistance training only group, were they doing more total work than the other combined groups in terms of their resistance training?
Yeah, no, they in that paper they did quantify training load. Can't quite remember, but I assume they just used the session RPE method. And yeah, as you would expect, the concurrent training groups are doing close to basically twice what the resistance training only group was doing.
But it wasn't specific to, it wasn't all resistance training, it was some high intensity interval training or continuous.
Yeah, yep.
So do you think that difference in resistance specific training would account for the different adaptive responses?
Difficult to say. Yeah. Not to want to change subjects of your question, but my biggest issue was maybe with the exercise order, and it's been interesting. There's been a few studies, particularly coming out of Sweden, a group there who have consistently shown endurance training before resistance training generates more hypertrophy, or at least equal hypertrophy as resistance training on its own. And again, I've looked and thought about this a lot, and I really do think it's about the training status of the individuals, and I do wonder with Jackson 5's study, if they had the resistance training first, how much difference that might have made. I don't have any major data to back me up, but my gut feeling is that resistance training first, whether it's a morning and an afternoon session or within the same session, is the best approach. And I know Keith Barr's written stuff saying the opposite, but that's just my gut feeling. I don't think it makes intuitive for me. It just doesn't make sense to have endurance before you resistance training from where I sit. So.
How many of those studies have looked at actual separation, the normal practical separation you would get if you did a morning endurance session and then an afternoon weight session, versus just doing them 2 hours apart, which doesn't really happen doesn't happen much in the real
Yeah, I mean, again, this is some of what I really like to try and find out. I know with a particular AFL club that I had a lot of contact with it in Melbourne, they would literally come off their team session on the park, not necessarily a purely conditioning session, but skills, team tactics, whatever, your normal team session, and would just go straight to lift, pretty much, like 10 minutes later. So it certainly does happen. But yeah, going back to your question, those studies are really hard to do, and that's pretty much the reason that no one's really tackled it. I mean, Jonathan mentioned Michael Everett before. Way back in '98, I think he did a study where the sessions were separated by 6 hours, but I can't recall what the outcome was. And I guess it's very difficult from a practical point of view. I mean, I should say, just like all my studies, they're all underpowered as well. Anything that has tried to look at the sequence, the time course, if we had the Manhattan Project that put us all together in a room and said, you know, you've got an unlimited budget, then you know that would be, we'd be doing sessions back to back, and then we'd have a 2-hour session break, and then a 4-hour and a 6-hour, and we'd have, you know, 200 in each group, and I'm sure we could nut this out, and because then we'd have equal number of groups doing the same thing with the other exercise order as well. It's a really complex problem to try and solve, and so it's really about trying to find the bite-sized pieces that we can try and can chew off, bite off at any one time, and try to accumulate. But it's interesting that there's not really any groups or many groups that have decided to take this on as a research area. So there's still tons of scope for this, for research in this area.
So is there some type of measurement possible? Let's say that actually shows that you're ready to do your resistance training?
It's a great question, and so we live in a molecular age, and you know, when we started out, we went looking for something like that, and that's one of the real problems with the invasive studies that have been done, and at least in part, why we haven't gone on to publish too much recently about this is that there's really not that one or two things in terms of biological markers that we can measure that is so responsive to one or the other of the stimulus that it's quite clear when there is some sort of molecular interference. If we can find something like that, I guess it's the same, well it's not the same, but you know, in terms of finding a cure for cancer, you're always after that one thing that's the sensitive marker that can show you what's happening at the muscle.
But that couldn't be on hormone level, or?
Okay. Well, it's going to be, it's clear, you know, it's never going to be one thing, and it's going to be an integrated network kind of approach. But you know, as far as I'm aware, we can't. There's nothing available right now, even in the applied setting either, that has the sensitivity to sort of work that out. As far as I know, in my opinion.
Haven't people tried to sort of get people to train when, you know, the testosterone is high relative to cortisol, and is that valid? I know people have done it. But it's
yeah, again, it's an interesting area, and at least you're probably aware within physiology well, it's not a Barney as such. There's different points of view as to the value or what those anabolic hormones, catabolic hormones are actually doing, if anything. But it is another avenue. Again, if you had the resources, it'd be something that you would add and look at in terms of trying to optimise that. It's very expensive as well for what information you do glean from it.
You mentioned fuel availability and stacking the sessions. What percentage of the studies have tried to control for that? And are there any going back to the question there, have you looked at biomarkers of fuel availability? Like, you've taken blood and tissue samples, is there anything in those samples that might indicate that fuel was an issue?
Carbohydrate, I guess, is just one fuel, but that's something that we've looked at, glycogen levels. I'm sure a lot of you are very familiar with the whole train low approach these days, and so we also wondered if that might have a negative effect on anabolic status, and again, that's another area that we'd love to follow up at some stage and start doing chronic studies, but at least in the acute sense, in the study that we did, training with low glycogen in a resistance training setting, whether it was without post-exercise protein or with it, didn't have any impact on levels of muscle protein synthesis in a resistance training setting. Answering the other part to that question in terms of, you know, have we found a suite or of proteins or a profile around the whole metabolism, nutrient effects? The short answer is no on that. We haven't been able to do that today. Yeah.
But we did show 5 days of low energy availability, reduced protein synthesis pretty significantly.
That is true, yes. We did go on to show that being in energy deficit, even for just 5 days before resistance training, certainly reduces the muscle protein synthesis response. That can be rescued through the use of protein. But, yeah, so again, getting back to the whole negative energy balance type of thing, that could be a factor.
What would be your, after seeing all this, like your top 3 advice to coaches to not do or to do?
Well, I think I've already laid out one of them, and that's in terms of exercise order. I would be trying to do my resistance training first, which is not always that popular, but it's also not always practical. I think intuitively, the further apart you can keep your sessions, the better. And in fact, that may mitigate, you know, some of the exercise order effects. I would still be trying to do resistance training first, but you know, wherever practical, having a minimum of a couple of hours, but more is better, I would say. And then I think actually probably the third thing I would say is optimal nutrition. As always, you know, when we started doing all these studies, or the studies I've shown from our lab, you have to start at baseline. So they're all done in the fasted state. So all those measurements post-exercise are in the fasted state. And, you know, without question, there's going to be a heavy influence of nutritional strategies potentially in that post-exercise period when all the, not just recovery, but the adaptation is happening. So, you know, quickly learned, saw the light. Nutrition is where it's all happening and what it's all about. Actually, exercise nutrient interactions, despite the need to sometimes separate them so you can answer one question at a time. Ultimately, you know, we need to be looking at the interactions between exercise and nutrition wherever we can.